This video was produced by the Top Cut. Be sure to check out thetopcut.net, your home for Pokemon TCG, tournament coverage, professional game analysis, and interviews with the best players in the world. Thanks for watching. Hey everybody, this is Pooka bringing you another edition of Deck Breakdown, where we take a look at the top decks in the format and break them down so that you can get an idea of what tournament level decks will look like. So in the first three editions of this, we had the three most popular decks in the format, which were Zekrom Electric number 1, CMT number 2, and Durant number 3. And we will round out this deck breakdown section for this portion of the season with the fourth most popular deck, which is the Terrakion deck. Now this did not see any play at all until state championships. It actually gained popularity after the first week when Curran Hill was able to take down Virginia State with it, and from there it just kind of took off. So the basic strategy of the deck is just, well, attack with Terrakion over and over and over. So the first version of this deck ran absolutely no other Pokemon besides 4 Terrakion, and that's kind of the version we're going to look at here. So without further ado, let's jump right into the solo Terrakion deck. So as always, we will start off by just taking a look at the deck as a whole. You can see there are very few Pokemon in this deck, only 4, which means we're going to have a ton of trainers and then energy as well. So this might seem a little strange for someone who's used to playing, a normal deck, which would have probably around 20 Pokemon, and then like 12, 13 energy, and then the rest trainers. Whereas this deck runs 4 Pokemon, and then energy, and then about 40 trainers. So this is definitely not a standard deck by any means in terms of conventional deck building. So that's why this is an interesting deck to take a look at. When you have so much space to add in extra cards, you can start to do some cool stuff with the deck. And your deck naturally becomes consistent just because, well, you only run 4 Pokemon, and they're all basics. So this is an overall look at the deck, and now we can break it down section by section. Of course, the Pokemon section won't be too complicated, but let's jump right into the most complicated section right off the bat, which will be the trainer cards. So here is a look at all the trainer cards for this deck. As I said before, there are a ton of them in this deck. There are actually 43. So over 2/3 of your deck are going to be trainers or supporters in this kind of a deck, just because you have so few Pokemon. And that makes it so you have so much room for trainers, because you don't want too many energy, otherwise you get clogged up and they aren't too useful. So trainer cards, you can usually find some useful ones, and you always have space for more. So let's just start off with the supporters. They're always going to be fairly basic in this format depending on what kind of deck you're running. You start off with 4 Oak's New Theory, 4 Professor Juniper. Those are kind of the standard draw supporters for this format. You don't really get much better than that. So 4 of each of those, that's pretty normal. Then we have 3N, which is also kind of becoming a standard. N actually isn't that great in this deck, but there really aren't too many good draw supporters, so you just kind of run it by default. At the beginning of the game, it can get you 6 cards, and of course later on it can disrupt your opponent and let you win a game that you might not have been able to win before. So the Oaks, the Juniper, and the N, those are all fairly standard, and then we have 2 Bianca in this deck as well. Now Bianca is kind of the next best draw supporter. As I said, N isn't too good in this deck because really you're going to be taking prizes early on pretty often. So N isn't going to net you too many cards when you play it later on in the game, because you'll have taken prizes, and you'll probably end up getting small hand sizes from it. So keeping this in mind, we'll actually play a few Biancas in this deck, just because it's very good at recovering from N. If you get put down to 1 or 2 cards and you draw Bianca, you can go back up to 6 cards immediately. Now, this isn't better than Oak's New Theory or Juniper, but it just kind of gives you extra insurance against cards like N, which would disrupt you. So Bianca is really the only other supporter that can help you recover from a devastating N late in the game, so that's why it gets some love here. And then of course we have a couple Pokegears as well. I don't think you need too many in this deck, but I can definitely see adding more if you really want to, but there's only two, just, to have more ways to get your supporters. You really do want a supporter every turn with this deck, because this is a deck that cannot afford to miss a turn of anything. If it misses one energy attachment or one attack, it can end up just losing, because when your deck is so simple and straightforward, you need to execute every turn. Otherwise, you don't really have any tricks to come back. So that will cover the supporters, and Poké here kind of falls into supporters as well. And then we'll move on to the normal trainers. So Heavy Ball kind of goes with supporters. It just searches for Terrakion, gets you a Pokemon with a 3 retreat cost or more, and Terrakion has 4 retreat costs, so you play 4 Heavy Ball just so you can search out your Terrakions. You might want to play a couple Dual Balls as well, just to make sure you get those Terrakions into play, but 4 Heavy Ball seems to be the standard, and that's why we have 4 of them here. And then we'll move on to 4 Junk Arm, 4 Catcher. This is pretty standard at this point. I could see maybe running 3 Catcher in this deck, but Catcher is just hands down probably the best trainer in the format. Maybe Junk Arm could be better because, well, Junk Arm can be anything, but on a whole, I think Catcher is better, and you really need it to start picking off cheap prizes. Retaliate with Terrakion doesn't always knock out stuff in one hit, so you need to Catcher around some big Pokemon sometimes and take some easy prizes. So 4 Catcher, 4 Junk Arm, pretty standard. And then we have the heart and soul of this deck, which is the EXP share. Now, every time your active Pokemon gets knocked out, you can use EXP share and then take any basic energy you want. You take 1 and then move it to the Pokemon with EXP share when your active gets knocked out. So the whole key to this deck is getting your experience shares into play, and then you can attack with your next Terrakion and keep attacking over and over, and you have an endless cycle of Terrakions. Of course, Retaliate takes 2 energy to attack, Land Crush takes 3, and you don't have any real energy acceleration in this deck, so you need to find a way to keep your energy in play, and EXP share is perfect. This is what makes the deck work, and this is what made it come onto the scene when Next Destinies came out. Because before that set, EXP share, it's the engine that keeps your deck running. And before that, if your active Terrakion got knocked out with all the energy on it, you had nowhere to go from there. So, for EXP share, this is by far the most important card in the deck. You definitely need 4 of these. And then we'll move on to 3 Switch. Terrakion's got a 4 retreat cost, so I could even see running 4 Switch in this deck. 3 seems to be pretty standard though. And then 3 Lost Removers, because a lot of decks depend on those double colorless energy, and you want to get rid of those as soon as possible. Mewtwo is one of your biggest enemies with this deck, and he uses double colorless a lot. So if you can remove those from play, you can really limit your opponent's options in terms of attacking. This is mainly used against the CMT deck because they rely on double colorless so much. So Lost Remover, there's 3 in this deck, just to make sure your opponent never gets to keep those double colorless energy in play. Very important for this deck. Then we have 3 Revives, just because you only play 4 Pokemon, so when they get knocked out, you need to get it back. So 3 Revives, pretty straightforward. Once your Terrakions get knocked out, you need new ones. So that's that. And then 3 plus power as well. Retaliate doesn't always get the job done. You max out at 90 damage, so you need some plus power sometimes to hit these damage barriers in order to knock out the defending Pokemon. So that should explain pretty much all the trainers, and now we'll move into the simpler sections, which will be the Pokemon and the energy, and we'll just start off with the Pokemon. So there you have it. These are the Pokemon for this deck. Count them: 1, 2, 3, 4 Terrakion. And that's it. So I guess when you're analyzing this, all you have to do is just take a look at why Terrakion is so good that it would have a deck just for him. And the answer just lies in his attacks. Well, first of all, it has 130 hit points, which means it's a big Pokemon. It can take quite a few hits before it goes down, and most things will not really knock it out in one hit. Maybe a Zekrom with a plus power can bolt strike you. If someone's still playing Reshiram, Blue Flare with a plus power, that can knock you out. And really, other than that, then there's Zekrom EX, which can knock you out with Strong Volt, but you actually want that because he's weak to fighting. You get to take 2 prizes when that happens. And the biggest threat's probably going to be Mewtwo EX, but it's actually kind of tough to get enough energy on a Mewtwo to knock out a Terrakion in one hit. So, for the most part, Terrakion is a pretty big Pokemon. He goes down in 2 hits most of the time. If he goes down in 1 hit, you're in some trouble. So, you're really depending on him to survive. And I guess from there, you just go into the attacks, which Retaliate. When you look at it, it does 30, that's not too impressive, but after your active Pokemon gets knocked out, Retaliate does 90 the next turn. So 90 damage for 2 energy, that is tremendous. That will allow you to pretty much knock out any Pokemon in the format in 2 hits. And if you're facing any Zekrom Electric decks, you can pretty much knock out their entire deck in 1 hit with Retaliate. Now Land Crush also does 90, but you can use it even if your Pokemon wasn't knocked out. So really this deck maxes out at 90 damage, but 90 is a pretty good number because it's going to knock out pretty much everything in the format in 2 hits. And with Terrakion being so tough and strong, with its 130 hit points, that's fine. You'll be trading 2-hit knockouts, and then eventually you should be able to get some cheap prizes with Pokemon Catcher on weaker Pokemon like Celebi or Electric, Dynamo, etc. So you should be able to win the trade eventually. So that's kind of the theory behind this deck. You just have 4 giant fighting Pokemon. Fighting's a very good type to have. Grass weakness is really good as well. There are very few grass Pokemon in this format. And really, you can just pummel your opponent with Terrakion as much as you want, and you'll end up winning a lot of games. This deck is very vulnerable to Trainer Lock decks, unfortunately. Anything with Vileplume is going to give you a lot of trouble because you don't really have much in terms of strategy or tricks. You have Retaliate and Land Crush, which do 90 damage, and Trainer Lock decks like The Truth with the Reuniclus can just move damage off, and you'll never beat those decks. Or even a Mew Vanillux Vileplume deck, that's going to give you a ton of trouble. So Trainer Lock decks are going to give this deck fits, but those aren't too popular right now. And this Terrakion deck is really just a counter to the metagame, and it just takes into account that the popular decks are CMT, Zekrom Electric, and Durant, and this does well against all 3 of those. So there you have it. These are the Terrakions that you'll be using. You might be crazy and use full art ones, but for the most part, these are the ones you're going to see. So these are the Pokemon, and we'll jump into the energy next. Alright, and here we have the energy. Nothing too complex. Runs about 12 fighting energy and then a rescue energy. Obviously, you just want to run fighting energy because Terrakion uses fighting, and then you need basic energy on your Pokemon in order to take advantage of experience share. So you want a ton of basic energy. You have 12 in this deck, and then there's a rescue energy thrown in there as well, just because you only play 4 Pokemon, so that rescue energy can help you get back a crucial Terrakion into your hand. When it gets knocked out, rescue energy allows you to bring the Terrakion back into your hand, so that's good as well. But for the most part, you want to focus on your basic energy. You also want at least about 12 to 14 in this deck, because you need to attach an energy every single turn. I would say 13 is a good number. You might want to bump it up to 14. I really can't stress enough the importance of playing an energy every turn. If you ever miss an energy drop, your whole deck's momentum is just gone. And if you miss a turn of using Retaliate, you're probably going to end up losing. So, energy, although it's pretty simple, it's very, very important for this deck. So, we've covered pretty much the entire deck. And now let's move into some interesting tech cards that you could maybe consider adding into your deck if you see some stuff in your metagame that you're worried about. So next up, let's talk tech. Okay, so just like the Durant deck, we have a lot of space to work with. We have 43 trainers in this deck, which means we could probably cut a couple here and there and add in some tech cards if we really want to. Now, when you talk about tech, the number one thing that pops up in almost every deck is going to be Mewtwo EX. X-Ball is just very versatile. It only takes colorless energy, so you can just splash him into pretty much every deck with a couple double colorless energy, and he'll work. So, number one will be Mewtwo. Of course, with Mewtwo comes the double colorless energy, and you need to start running a couple of those, maybe 3 or even 4, which kind of screws up your consistency a little bit. And you could also start with Mewtwo, which would be a bummer, but really one of the biggest problems for this deck is when your opponent gets a ton of energy on his own Mewtwo EX and can start using X-Ball to knock out your Terrakions in one hit. So, if you play a Mewtwo of your own, you can start to counter that a little bit and just X-Ball his for a cheap 2 prizes and go from there. So, Mewtwo is probably the most commonly seen tech in this deck. Moving on to Landorus. This gives you another option for this deck in terms of an attacker. Some people are turned off by the fact that there's only 4 Pokemon in the whole deck, so you can add 4 Landorus as well. Then you'd have to change up your supporters a little bit. You might want to run Sage's Training, just so you can use Abundant Harvest on the first turn, get some fighting energy in your discard pile, and threaten with a turn 2 Gaia Hammer. Landorus is also pretty good against Durant, so if that's big in your area, you would run Landorus instead of just plain Terrakion. So there are other versions with Landorus and Terrakion, so that's definitely something you have to consider. Now, here we have some interesting tech trainers, and we'll start off with the first one being Ruins of Elf. Why in the world would you ever play this card? Well, one of Terrakion's biggest problems can be Pokemon that are resistant to fighting. So, if you play Ruins of Elf, there's suddenly no more resistance. So a Pokemon like Tornadus, which formerly would resist you, now has no fighting resistance. So this opens up the door for something like you play Ruins of Elf down, and then you drop 2+ powers, and suddenly you can knock out a Tornadus in one hit. Also, Ruins of Elf is very, very good against the CMT deck. Now, why? Why would it ever be good? Well, the CMT deck is very reliant on its Sky Arrow Bridge, giving its Pokemon free retreat cost. The Celebi, the Smeargle, you know the deal. But if you play Ruins of Elf and counter their Sky Arrow Bridge, those Pokemon no longer have a free retreat cost. So, you screw up their entire strategy just by countering their stadium. So Ruins of Elf might be a card worth considering. Next up we have Black Belt, which is kind of a surprise plus 40 damage card. It can really catch your opponent off guard, and you can get some one-hit knockouts that they wouldn't expect you to get. So Black Belt is a pretty neat tech in this deck because you jump up your damage from 90 to 130 in one turn, which can knock out quite a few things. You know, it can knock out a Tornadus in one hit, it can knock out an opposing Terrakion, and a Mewtwo EX with an Eviolite. Now you can knock it out in 2 hits with Black Belt. So, Black Belt's definitely a card worth considering because, well, your deck is pretty straightforward, and sometimes you need that extra oomph. The main reason it wouldn't work is because Terrakion is a pretty aggressive deck, so you're not always behind on prizes. But if you are, Black Belt can help out. The next one is probably the most feared card in the whole format, Crushing Hammer. Now, if you can fit these into your deck, go for it. You flip a coin if heads, you discard an energy attached to one of your opponent's Pokemon, which can completely cripple your opponent. You know, against a deck like CMT, if you discard their grass energy and then play a Lost Remover, discard their double colorless, you can completely disable them the entire game. So, Crushing Hammer, that's going to be devastating if you can land a couple of those. Normally we only see that card pop up in Durant decks, but definitely could be worth a spot here. Next up is Defender. You might be thinking, well, why wouldn't I run Eviolite since Terrakion is a basic? Well, you have to use Experience Share in this deck, which is a tool. So you can't attach 2 tools at once, meaning you can't play Eviolite. But you can still run Defender. This can help you avoid one-hit knockouts and really just make your Terrakions survive longer. And if they survive longer, that's perfect. They already have 130 hit points. So if you can survive against things that are trying to knock you out in one hit, like a Zekrom using Bolt Strike with a plus power, that's just going to help you win the game. So Defender could be a game-winning card sometime, might be worth adding. And last up, you might be laughing about this one, but Potion is actually a solid card in this deck. If you can remove damage from your Terrakion, you can actually avoid being knocked out. Imagine a situation where your opponent sends up a Tornadus and uses Hurricane for 80, and then you play a Potion, remove 30, and then you Junk Arm for your Potion and remove 30 more. All of a sudden you're back down to only 20 damage on yourself, and you're not in any danger of being knocked out. So Potion, it can actually go a long way in helping you survive. So these are some techs to look out for in this deck. You might want to try some of them out. Now you might notice I did not include Tornadus in this list. That's because the Tornadus Terrakion deck is a completely different deck. They're built much differently than this. So if you're interested in running the Tornadus Terrakion deck, which might be known as Troll, that's going to be built completely differently. So I didn't include Tornadus here, but that is something to consider as well. But that will wrap up this edition of Deck Breakdown. Hope you guys enjoyed this and learned a little bit of something about how to build this deck and what makes it tick. So, if you did enjoy it, just leave some feedback down in the comments. Let us know what you think. And I've been Pooka from the Top Cut, and I'll see you guys next time. Thanks for watching.